Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gabe Cohen. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications for GuideStar, and I want to welcome you to the second in our series of conversations on nonprofit overhead. I'm going to start by just doing a quick bit of housekeeping today, and then we're going to pass it along to the panelists. Two things of note. First, this is an interactive conversation. We want to encourage everyone to ask questions throughout the presentation today. And you can do that in two different ways. One, by the questions tab of GoToWebinar, or also on Twitter using the hashtag #OverheadMyth. The second thing to note is that we are recording today's webinar, and that will be emailed to you at the end of the event today. So with that, I want to hand it over to Mari Kuraishi, who's the co-founder and president of GlobalGiving, the first and largest global crowdfunding community that connects nonprofits, donors, and companies in nearly every country in the world. Mari is also the board chair of GuideStar, so we are very happy to have her with us today. And with that, Mari, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gabe, and I want to echo Gabe's welcome to everybody on this webinar. Just a couple words of introduction about what we're here to do today. This is the second of 3 conversations on nonprofit overhead. The first conversation happened in October, and it covered the role of media, researchers, and technology in changing the nonprofit overhead conversation. Jacob was joined by the co-author of the groundbreaking research on the issue, Michael Etzel of the Bridgespan Group, as well as Ben Painter of Fast Company, who's been one of the few in the media to address the issue. Today's conversation is about how leaders across the foundation and nonprofit sectors are changing the conversation about nonprofit overhead. And in just a couple minutes, I'll introduce everyone who is going to be taking part in this conversation. The third conversation, which will probably happen in early 2017, is a conversation with the leaders of organizations who are changing the overhead conversation from the inside. Now, just to switch gears and to introduce the people who will be taking part in the conversation today, let me start with Dan Cardinali, who is the president and CEO of Independent Sector, a membership organization that brings together nonprofits, foundations, and corporations to advance the common good. Dan is known across the sector as a thought leader in the field of public education and for his commitment to performance management to drive evidence-based programs in high-impact organizations. Prior to joining IS, Dan led Communities in Schools, the nation's largest and most effective dropout prevention organization. In addition, Dan is a 2007 Annie Casey Children and Families Fellow and leads the K-12 subcommittee of the Presidential Advisory Communication on Educational Excellence for Hispanics. Next, we have Jacob Harold. Jacob is the president and CEO of GuideStar, the world's largest database of information about nonprofits. Under his leadership, GuideStar has launched several groundbreaking tools for searching for and assessing nonprofit, including the GuideStar Search and Platinum GuideStar Nonprofit Profile Participation Level. Prior to GuideStar, Jacob led the philanthropy program at the Hewlett Foundation, where he oversaw $30 million in grants that together aim to build a 21st century infrastructure for smart giving. For his work in the sector, Jacob has been named to Nonprofit Times Power and Influence Top 50 list for the last 3 years. And last but not least, we have Darren Walker, who is, of course, the president of the Ford Foundation, the nation's second largest philanthropy, and for 2 decades has been a leader in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. He led the philanthropy committee that helped bring a resolution to the City of Detroit's historic bankruptcy and chairs the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance. Prior to joining Ford, Darren was VP of the Rockefeller Foundation, where he managed the Rebuild New Orleans initiative after Hurricane Katrina. In 2016, Time magazine named Darren to its annual list of the 100 most influential people in the world. So as you can see, we have an illustrious panel here. We will start today with a few remarks from Jacob, setting the scene, and then it'll be followed by panel conversation Q&A. I will moderate the session. We've got a lot of questions already from from the participants of this webinar, and we anticipate a lot more will come up in the course of the discussion. So Jacob, over to you.
Terrific. Thank you, Mari, and thank you all for joining us on this this critical conversation. Happy Monday to you, and happy holidays. It's been quite a year, and I think it's fair to say that these are challenging times for many, and they even feel like dark times at certain moments as we think about what we have happening around the world, whether in Aleppo right now or closer to home in Flint, Michigan. We're reminded of the work that we have to do as a society to build the just and sustainable world that we all dream of, and that there are great challenges ahead. But I also hope that we can be reminded of the extraordinary work that is done by the nonprofit sector, by philanthropy, by civil society, by the American people to stand up with their back straight for what they believe in, to reach out a hand in service, and that this is a core aspect of the American character. And more than that, it's become a core part of the American economy. The nonprofit sector is responsible for $1 trillion a year of economic activity. More than 15 million people are employed by nonprofits. It's an immense institutional presence in American society. And that is one of many reasons why it is such a tragedy that that scale and complexity and diversity and importance represented by the nonprofit sector is so often distilled into cursed pie charts that claim, with a simple ratio, to share the quality of a nonprofit organization based on its overhead ratio. And given the importance of philanthropy in the nonprofit sector in our society, in the U.S. but around the world as well, given its diversity, its complexity, this is a betrayal, I believe, of the work that many of us do. And so our challenge is to figure out how do we go beyond these pie charts to a conversation about nonprofit performance that's actually related to the work that we do every day trying to make the world better. So how did we get here? I believe that there is plenty of blame to go around. We are all the blue crayon in this cartoon here. Journalists have been kind of lazy in telling the story about nonprofits. Individual donors have, in a desperate desire to hold organizations accountable, fallen back on this lowest common denominator of overhead. Organizations like GuideStar have prominently displayed the overhead ratio, reinforcing this myth. And then nonprofits, who make up the majority of the folks on this call today, have also contributed to the overhead myth. We've done one back-of-the-envelope calculation that suggests that about 1 billion times a year, nonprofits send out a fundraising letter to the donors of America that prominently displays the overhead ratio. We have collectively trained the American people to believe that overhead is how we should be judged. So one of the first steps is for us to all acknowledge our responsibility in getting us to this absurd situation, but also, I would say, our power to get out of it. And we can have great confidence that deep down, people care about results. The research is quite clear. Here's one example done by the consulting firm Hope Consulting, their Money for Good research, that shows very clearly that individual donors, foundation staff, and the advisors that serve both of them care about financials, but they also care about effectiveness and impact. And so it is possible for us to shift this conversation. And then thinking about the 1,000 people who are on this call today, we did a survey of you all, and it's quite clear that you are a bit more enlightened than many of your fellow citizens. So for example, we saw that only a very small percentage of the nonprofits on the call today use the overhead ratio in your marketing materials. And similarly, that of the foundations that are on the call today, they're proud to fund their grantees full costs, to recognize that they have a responsibility to match the economics of the organizations they're supporting, and not assume that others will subsidize them. So there are a lot of folks in the field who recognize that we can do much better. And I, for one, imagine a world where we have moved beyond the overhead conversation to a more meaningful conversation. And we see three basic components that could get us there. We need to have information about nonprofits that is multidimensional, that tells a full story. We need to present that information in a way that becomes familiar to donors, so that they're not starting from scratch each time when they try to understand a nonprofit. And then we need to efficiently distribute that across the nonprofit community. At GuideStar, we are doing our part in that, and I will share here the new profiles that GuideStar has built that attempt to tell this multidimensional story about nonprofits, that talk about a nonprofit strategy and the thinking behind why you do the work that you do to achieve your mission. A detailed explanation of nonprofit financials over time so that your story is placed in history. An understanding of the governance that ensures accountability at your organization. The voices of your stakeholders as an important input into the work that you do. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, actual data about your success in achieving your mission. And that we are beginning to see that multidimensional story. And then importantly, that is not just viewed by the 8 million people who use GuideStar each year, but also through the many other platforms that people use on a day-to-day basis to make decisions. There are now 218 other platforms using GuideStar's data, and I'm excited to say that as of just a couple weeks ago, that includes Facebook, which is used by billions of people every year. So we have reason for hope. We also recognize that we have a lot of work to do as a field to line up our message, our language, and our strategy to move beyond the overhead conversation to a conversation about results. At the last webinar, we did a survey of the audience just around the question of language. What should we call it? Should we call it core costs? That's what won, or operational costs. Not many people thought we should call it overhead. Goulet of the great blog Nonprofit with Balls suggested we should just call it things we need in order to do our job of helping people, damn it. It's a little unwieldy, but it does get the point across. But we face an opportunity and a challenge here to shift to a new conversation. And that's why we brought together these extraordinary field leaders in Dan and Mari and Darren to have a conversation about how we might move forward. And so with that, I will hand it back to Mari to facilitate that conversation.
Great. Thank you, Jacob, for setting us up. And you know, I want to start with what you said, that we have an opportunity and a challenge to shift the conversation. And we have deliberately picked, you know, Dan, who represents the nonprofit sector, and Darren, who represents the funding sector. Obviously, there's a lot of diversity in each of these categories that I mentioned, but basically, you know, it takes two to tango. There's a funder and there's a nonprofit, and if the funder says so high, we tend to say, you know, yes, absolutely, we will jump. So it raises in my mind the question, and maybe Darren, I might start with you. How do you think the funder part of our community might start shifting the conversation? What specifically, in fact, has the Ford Foundation done to change, to begin to shift that conversation?
Thank you, Mari, and thank you, Jacob, for the invitation to be a part of this very important webinar. I come to this conversation as a person who has been an executive in philanthropy in 2 large legacy foundations for almost 20 years, and as someone who has served on 2 foundation boards, and as someone who has served on over a dozen nonprofit boards. So I come to this conversation with, I think, a pretty fulsome understanding of both sides of this challenge, and I feel the responsibility, the culpability of this this dilemma, this unfortunate circumstance is, for the most part, the responsibility of funders. And foundations like my own and others have been responsible for, in some ways, perpetrating and extending a notion that we know not to be true. And that is that the way in which we fund our grantees' core costs, in many ways, it creates and distorts the behavior of the nonprofit sector. And so I believe that what we at the Ford Foundation have to do is use our voice in philanthropy to speak honestly and candidly and truthfully about this circumstance and our culpability in it. And so I just believe that as we have looked at our own work here at Ford, we see evidence of what we have done wrong and how we have contributed to this situation, and we're taking steps internally and in speaking to the sector to address it.
That's great. Thank you, Darren, for that. Maybe, Dan, I know you at the independent sector have been looking a lot about the power dynamics between funder and nonprofits. Sort of given Darren's sort of very generous stance that funders sort of bear the brunt of the responsibility around this, what do you think nonprofits can and should do to support this first step that organizations like Ford are taking?
First of all, thank you, Mari. Jacob, Darren, great to be with you. And I'm just delighted with the conversation. I think this is one of the most important conversations if we're going to really aspire to the social change we in the social sector do. This has got to be wrestled with. So, Darren, I so appreciate your clarity and boldness on philanthropy, and I would say philanthropy clearly has contributed to this kind of lockdown that overhead is in right now. I think there's also, having been 25 years on primarily in the nonprofit side, both at the very grassroots level and then running a national network, there is a strong responsibility that nonprofits bear here too, in two fundamental dimensions. One, I think, is that nonprofits, we are really responsible for representing what it takes to get our work done. And that has a outcomes focus. What, in fact, are we going to hold ourselves accountable to? It doesn't mean that that's just in health and human service or education. That can be really across the spectrum. But I think we have to be clear, and to be clear about what it then, the second element, is going to take for us to actually get that accomplished, the real cost. And I think then there has to be a boldness and a willingness to not give away our power when we sit down with the philanthropic community or the individual donor. And if we can't accomplish what we're trying to get accomplished with the financial structure, do we really have to then admit that we probably shouldn't be taking the resources if we can't get the outcomes we aspire to? And that is our responsibility. So clarity about what it is we're trying to get accomplished and what it really takes isn't for someone else to tell us. It is for us to be clear, and ideally in partnership. So many of the best philanthropic institutions that think about this and are bold about reframing the overhead really partner with nonprofit organizations and kind of co-create or develop what in fact it's going to take to move the needle.
That's a bold stance you're taking, Dan. You're essentially saying that nonprofits, if faced with a grant or a financing package that doesn't fully cover costs, we should actually stand our ground and say, you know what, that's actually not going to let us deliver the outcomes we want.
So let me tell you why I say that.
Yeah.
And in my almost 20 years at communities and schools, we dug deep into our own work. And it became very evident to us that when we were either not focused on outcomes and or under-resourced in our ability to deliver value, we in fact ran the risk of, one, doing no material benefits to the young people we were working with, and at times we could actually contribute negatively to their experience.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a deep responsibility for those who care about social change to be bold and honest, that you feel good and courageous because you're kind of in the cause, but then what does it actually take? You could be counterproductive by not being clear about the resources you need. It's not sexy, and it is not, it's kind of the other side of the conversation. So I don't want to take away from Darren's boldness around philanthropy. There has to be a corresponding partner on the other side. But we're not powerless in this conversation, especially if we're community-based and engaged in what it really takes to get the work done.
Mm-hmm.
May I just interject here?
Yeah.
Because I believe, Dan, that it is admirable, and I so appreciate what you say, but we have to consider context. And the context is one of a tremendous imbalance of power and influence in the relationship. And that for many nonprofits, whether it's a foundation or even government, and particularly the local governments that many nonprofits rely on, they don't feel they have the power to basically say, we won't do this work because the amount of money in your contract or your grant doesn't really cover what you think you are paying for. I just don't think it's realistic to expect that most nonprofits, particularly the kinds of nonprofits like the one that I led in Harlem, would feel empowered enough to simply walk away from a grant or a contract if it did not include sufficient overhead.
So let me. I don't want to pretend like there isn't a very powerful lack of power on the nonprofit side. There is. But there's, I think that's why, one, this conversation is so critically important, why a number of organizations that are set up, like GuideStar, Independent Sector, or the National Council on Nonprofits, that are really taking this on full head and need to, and your leadership, Darren, in speaking out against, on this in the philanthropic sector, I think are critically important. So I don't want to set up small community-based nonprofits to feel like they're failures because they're not advocating. I get that. But it, often, to Jacob's point, we in the nonprofit sector then sell individual stories or anecdotes and contribute to the very problem that we are trying to undo. And I don't think we're completely powerless in the conversation. I think there is a responsibility we have to step up, particularly, again, I can't just, we had, most of our affiliates at community schools had $500,000 or less, and they were serving kids in some cases well, in other cases not. And there was a real need to reframe that conversation. When we did, they drove materially better outcomes for kids. So
then I think that raises, in my mind, Dan, you mentioned your affiliates and the role that the national organization, communities and schools played in sort of helping the smaller affiliates essentially up their game.
That's exactly it.
Which, sort of at a meta level makes the question about infrastructure organizations like GuideStar, even organizations like mine, GlobalGiving, how can we help the smaller, less well-resourced nonprofits not do the homework, the full homework of like figuring out their costs? How can we give them templates, training, the support necessary to have the data that leads to a better conversation between a funder and a nonprofit so that they're not each starting from scratch? Maybe, Jacob, you could talk a little bit about the directions GuideStar is thinking in this.
Well, and I'll just say, what I love about this conversation already is that both Darren and Dan are saying, yes, I am the blue crayon. Yes, I and people like me have a responsibility here. And I think that is very true for infrastructure organizations like GuideStar or GlobalGiving. And that, we are the blue crayon too. GuideStar has never been a rating agency. But we used to prominently display the overhead ratio on the profile pages that are looked at by 8 million people a year. And we took it down. We stopped doing that. And that's a small gesture, but one where we had to face some blowback. And it gets to, what is courage? Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is acting in the presence of fear. And And I think all of us in the field have to recognize that there will be consequences for decisions that we make, and that people who are stuck in an old way of thinking may not be happy with it. But in our rapidly changing world, I think we have no choice but to move forward and to think ahead. And I think GuideStar is in a unique and very lucky position to try to advance this conversation and to try to take some of the burden upon our own shoulders and off of the shoulders of small community-based nonprofits, and also off of the shoulders of donors. How do we make it easier for a donor to make an informed decision that is informed by the right kinds of metrics? And how do we make it as easy as possible for a nonprofit to tell the story of their progress against their mission and not just the story of their finances? And we've invested millions of dollars in the last several years to make it easier for nonprofits to tell that story. And we've had 128,000 nonprofits share at least some data directly with us to complement the data that we get from the Form 990. But we've got to figure out how do we take that and drive that number up even higher, because only about 1,500 nonprofits have shared programmatic, quantitative programmatic data with GuideStar. So we need that 1,500 to go to 100,000. And we've got to continue to make it easier, help nonprofits understand how this data flows around the field, and take as much of that burden on our shoulders as we possibly can, so that nonprofits and donors are able to focus on what they're good at. And I think there's reason to be optimistic, but we recognize we've got a long way to go.
So then that raises in my mind, Jacob, the question, we can certainly set better standards for and move away from things like overhead ratio and come up with more granular, more appropriate data. But, simplicity wins, right? And in one dimension, simplicity wins, as Dan referenced, because anecdotes work. Stories about individual beneficiaries or individual donors or individual families, they light people's eyes up, and they motivate action. And I think as nonprofits, we because we're doing the work of the public good, we tend to sort of get very convinced of being special snowflakes, and we're all different, and you can't apply that ratio to me because my work is just so specific and different. How do we strike the right balance between specificity and the dumbness of one ratio, which clearly doesn't apply to many different organizations, and communicate what currently is being communicated through stories and anecdotes to the donor community, particularly to funders that are not as sophisticated as the Ford Foundation?
I mean, and I would actually love to hear Darren and Dan's thoughts on this question as well. I will say that when we look at other aspects of the human experience where people make complex decisions, they actually don't rely on just one number. When people are buying a house, they don't just say, how many square feet does it have? They care about its architecture and its location and the trees that are around it, its history, how big are its windows, is it environmentally sustainable? People are fully capable of making a decision based on multiple data points. And we see that throughout life. But again, that puts responsibility on GuideStar and others to make that easy, the way that a Zillow or a Trulia or a Redfin does in the process of buying or renting a home. And so that burden is on our shoulders, and I think we've made real progress. And I think we don't have to get down to a single number, and there's no way that we're ever going to be able to coherently compare an art museum to a homeless shelter with just one number. However, we do have a lot of work to do to simplify. And right now, I showed you on GuideStar a whole bunch of data, and it's really cool, and I think it's really fun to look through, but it's not a quick answer. And the one thing that inspires me, actually, are nutrition labels on packaged food, because they are a way where many different kinds of information are brought together in a way that's very familiar for a consumer, and they're able to make different kinds of decisions, whether they're deciding based on number of calories or whether they're able to pronounce every ingredient. And so I think a challenge that we face as a field is how do we begin to say what are the key elements that can be brought together in a visually familiar way. that can help people make better decisions. But with that, I'd love Darren, maybe Darren, do you have any thoughts on how we can strike that balance?
Well, I think, Jacob, that you've hit on the need to develop metrics that are standard, that are understood, and that are as simple and digestible as possible. So I do believe that you can be helpful, and GuideStar is already being helpful in developing different approaches to understanding effectiveness, organizational effectiveness. I think the larger issue is that, and I'm encouraged by the fact that there are a number of foundations and in the federal government a real reset around this issue of core costs, overhead, whatever you will. There's a real interest. There are a group of California foundations that engaged in a collective experiment. Bridgespan is working with a group of foundations interested in this question. So the Ford Foundation is far from alone being engaged in this issue. And I think what we need to do, among the things we need to do, is to use our voice, our platform, our bully pulpit, to call out this as a problem that needs to be solved and won't be solved until we are able to recalibrate what we actually pay our grantees. And so to my mind, I'm eager to move the conversation in philanthropy, not just institutions, but to high net worth philanthropists. People, I was in a meeting recently, and a well-to-do philanthropist, individual donor, made the statement that he wants 100% of his grants to go directly to serving people and not to for the overhead. And I challenged him on the efficacy of his philosophy. I think he believes he's actually being a smart donor. I don't believe that he's being a smart donor. I think he's freeloading off of other donors, and in doing so, allowing himself to believe that 100% of his funding is going to direct services. So I just think we have a ways to go, and we have to drive this conversation. Those of us in foundations at the leadership level have to drive this conversation, be relentless, be willing to put our own inadequacies and our own vulnerabilities on the line here.
Dan, maybe if I could ask you to comment on sort of balance between simplicity and complexity, but also the role that organizations like independent sector can play in this. And then a call back to your previous life in community and schools. There's a question from the audience about whether you could give some specific examples of what you're hoping smaller nonprofits can actually do.
Sure. So to the first point, I agree with both Jacob and Darren. And I think that the only thing that I would add to, I think their smart remarks and spot on, would be that there is a period of transition that we're going to have to live through, that this isn't going to happen overnight, and that there is an importance of having both philanthropic leaders like Darren very much challenging the conversation, rooms where often nonprofit leaders aren't admitted. And so there is a unique and very powerful role. At the same time, the work of GuideStar and others, but GuideStar particularly plays a very important role of just forcing a conversation by virtue of managing simplicity with some complexity and forcing the market to kind of manage through it. I would add a third dimension, which is, I think, true for philanthropy as well as for nonprofits, to look for smart, fundable ways to build capacity, which then bridges to the question, I think, that was asked, that again, I'm a very firm believer that you don't need random control trials to be an organization committed to being data-driven and committed to ongoing quality improvement. There are actually extremely simple tools that are almost free that build that mechanism within the context of even very small and seemingly under-resourced organizations. I think Fort's been involved in it, but there's been a group of foundations, the Fund for Shared Insight. Really powerful example of using feedback, very low-cost feedback, to become client-centric as a way of beginning to develop this muscle. So there's a myth, I think, that being data-driven or evidence-based is cost-prohibitive and impossible even for community-based organizations. I do think that there should be a reward system so you could imagine having smaller community-based organizations having a much lower threshold of what evidence-based would be rather than the large contracting organizations. I think that's right, that there's a continuum out there that really allow folks to see themselves across that continuum and then accessible tools to be able to kind of journey forward. So that would be a role we would see independent sector contributing to, that really holding a set of national conversations. What does it mean to be evidence-informed in your decision-making regardless of your size? How do you tell a story that's both anecdotal as well as data-driven? And beginning to reframe the power dynamic, to Darren's earlier point, that no, just because you're a smart foundation and you've done 3 research projects on this, it doesn't mean you have all the answers. We want to give power back to community-based organizations and using cost-effective ways that data can tell that story.
So Dan, you raise an interesting point, how conversations that are, there's many things blossoming in our space, whether it's a Fund for Shared Insight, which of course the Ford Foundation is a core member of, where funders got together and started talking about the importance of feedback loops, talking to the people we actually seek to help, as opposed to just talking to nonprofits or just talking to funders. But there's also another community that I know you're engaged in, the Leap of Reason community, Maria Marino's group of organizations ranging from funders to nonprofits that are really talking about how can nonprofits up their own game around performance and do so in ways that don't take us down the RCT rabbit hole. How do we, and this is really a conversation for any of you, how do we sort of mix and match the efforts that are going on in different parts of our ecosystem, whether it's among funders or it's among the infrastructure organizations or among the nonprofits? How do those pieces not sort of languish in their own little bright spots? How do those get knit together into a broader movement or shift?
Well, I think that part of the way that happens is by making sure that we are networked in all of this work. So, for example, within philanthropy, I think the set of activities underway to understand true costs or core costs there is overlap between work going on nationally, work going on locally and state, for example, as in California, as I mentioned, and work going on at the federal government, because in fact the federal government, OMB, has issued new guidelines around overhead and indirect costs. So we have to ensure that we are networked and in touch, and that we are with the independent sector, with GuideStar, that the ecosystem is moving not in lockstep, but directionally. I think it's fair to say that over the last couple of years, there has been greater awareness, attention, discussion, debate in the sector about this. We have seen it in the literature, whether it's in the Chronicle or the Stanford Social Innovation Review and other journals. There is more conversation going on about this. And so I'm really encouraged, but we're going to have to cross the finish line at some point to a different place. And that place has to be one that makes room for a nonprofit not being deemed a low performer because they have 25% overhead, for example. And that gives them the space to explain why 25% overhead is needed. And in some cases, and this is where it gets dangerous, because the movement towards metrics means that things that can't be easily quantified are often jettisoned because donors want to know, quote unquote, what I'm buying. And there are lots of things that matter in the world that can't be measured in an econometric model. And my worry is that in our rush for effectiveness and high performance, those two things are defined narrowly. And I think that would be a huge disservice to the social sector.
I just want to echo that concern. While I, in my professional life, have been a kind of tireless advocate for kind of rigorous performance management and driving outcomes, and seeing the results of what that can mean in the face of kind of intractable problems like the impact of poverty on K-12 students. I think Darren is spot on that there has to be a much more comprehensive and robust, for lack of a better term, marketplace of what results can be, and recognizing that the social sector is not either business or government. It plays a unique role. And so it should be not only entitled, but it should claim for itself that the set of results can be unique to it unto itself. And therefore, business or government then has to bend into us, not the other way around, which is what it's felt like, pretty much over the last 30 years.
And it reminds me of a phrase we often use here at GuideStar, which is no stories without numbers and no numbers without stories. That we have to bring together different ways of communicating to reach different parts of people's minds and to explain the depth that comes from a story, but also that can help to understand the breadth that may come from a quantitative analysis. And it's our challenge, and it is not unique to the nonprofit sector, but it is especially, I think, intense for us to bring together the numbers and the stories. And I think there are a set of concrete things, building on what Darren said about a network of different players, that we'll be able to do over the next few years to make progress. So one is we need to agree on a common language. We are using a lot of different words to describe very similar things, and that's something independent sector has already been quite helpful in convening a set of conversations to try and figure out what's the language we want to use, what can we agree on that. A second piece is some shared stories. How do we have a handful of stories about nonprofits that have broken through and transcended this old conversation that can give hope to the rest of the field? And then finally, and this may sound a bit wonky, but I think it's very important, we do have to be willing to use common data standards. If we're ever going to show the diversity of different metrics that are relevant in the nonprofit sector, and I believe there are many thousands, we just have to share those in a consistent way to reveal that diversity, because otherwise it's chaos. And that's one place where technology can really help us to tell that much more complex story. Mostly, this is a challenge about people and politics and language and narrative, but there is a technology element, and if we can agree to share metrics that are relevant for us in a common format, it's going to be much easier for us to tell the story of this collective diversity of the nonprofit field.
Yeah, so, Darren was the first one to bring up the point about how metrics can overshadow the things that cannot be measured. Dan and Jacob, you both echoed this. I'm reminded, in my old life of international development at the World Bank, there's an entire industry, academic industry, looking at impact, evaluation, et cetera. and this segment, in fact, started the RCT movement in this space, typified by the MIT Poverty Lab and IPA. And in the past couple of years, they've gone through their own version of blowback with people like Nobel Prize winner Angus Deaton saying, just because, RCTs can give you very quantitative data doesn't mean that all solutions that benefit humanity can be subject to the RCT lens. And it's like the man looking for his keys underneath the lampshade, say, well, this is only, the RCT only illuminates this little round spot, whereas there's darkness all around us. And I wonder if perhaps, we need to bring in allies, whether it's the academic community. There's a lot of complexity in what we're trying to do. And I feel a little bit like we're all being asked to do it on our own time, with our own resources, and just muddle through it. I'm struck by some of the questions from the audience, but smaller nonprofits just don't have that much bandwidth to figure this out. And if we sort of all make it up, we risk making the field look, just not together.
Yep. So I was going to, there are a number of things. I just want to say one and then let my colleagues comment. One of the fundamental reframes is around the notion of evidence or result as binary. If we can pull back from the notion that you either get them or you don't, and really talk much more developmentally about what you're aspiring to do and how you grow and learn how to do that, whether you're tiny or huge, we're all in that same process. So I think, and it's how human beings are, right? So it's intuitive to all of us, right? With anybody that's seen a child develop, you just know that you learn through trial and error and moving forward. So I think there's a very important reframe in the conversation that allows for kind of developmental impact as opposed to binary notion of result. Just like watching nonprofits across the country, when they get that reframe, it gives them control over their work in a way that I think is enormously empowering. Not to take away from the fact that there are lots of pressures that push them in a different direction. And certainly I'm extremely interested in driving that reframe on the conversation. And we see GuideStar and other folks doing immensely important work. Just the slide that Jacob put up just showed a multiplicity. Again, complex for right now, but we're getting there. So that would just be my overture to response.
Yeah, and I would just say that I worry deeply about the sector moving away from interventions and programs that don't lend themselves to RCT type experiments or proxies for that, and that we all contribute to it by reinforcing the idea. And I understand that for a lot of donors, they want to have clear evidence. They need a particular kind of data to demonstrate efficacy. But I worry, deeply worry. I ask myself, how often do I hear of a new billionaire saying, I want to invest in arts education, or I want to invest in the humanities? I understand and support and believe desperately that we need vaccines and we need research and we need the kinds of things that, that will advance human development. But the humanities and arts and culture also advances human development. And people like Esther Duflo at the Poverty Action Lab in Boston will be the first to say, even though she's one of the queens of RCTs, that there are many things that philanthropy and government should be supporting that can't be RCT'd, if you will.
And someone from the audience reminded me, we're lapsing into our own jargon. RCT stands for Randomized Controlled Trial. It's something we've borrowed from the hard sciences, particularly the medical field, where you take a new drug and you test it out on various people along with a placebo so that you know whether your drug is making a difference.
And it's a very powerful model, but it simply doesn't apply to the diversity of the nonprofit sector. An example I like to give is you can't imagine doing a randomized control trial on advocacy group work around climate change. We can't have a control universe with no Sierra Club. And so we have to think about other ways of thinking about effectiveness that complement the randomized control trial model.
Yeah. So then you raised this point about sort of moving away from the binary, yes, there's a result, or no, there isn't a result, and thinking of things developmentally. In my own mind, I think of this sort of as a dynamic process of organizations being learning organizations. And failures are as important as successes because it teaches you how not to do something the next time around. Which raises a question for me, Jacob. I think for an organization like GuideStar, in some ways, is your audience funders? Yeah, well, absolutely, right? They use your platform to see what a nonprofit is doing. But what is the potential for a nonprofit to use GuideStar as a benchmarking, as a learning environment to sort of say, well, I do, K-12 education in this particular area. Can I find all the other organizations that are doing K-12 education and begin to sort of compare myself so that I can get better in the dimensions that I care about?
And you mentioned Esther Duflo. I'll mention another Esther Dyson, who said, make new mistakes. And I think one of the keys to learning to make new mistakes. But for that to happen, you have to learn from your own mistakes, but often you're also learning from other people's mistakes. And I think one of the dangers is that we allow the nonprofit sector to be a series of individual organizations learning in isolation and not getting economies of scale from our collective work and our collective sense of community. And that's where I do think an organization like GuideStar, an independent sector, and others can help us create the platforms where that learning happens across organizations, not just within organizations. And when GuideStar was originally founded, we were structured to help donors, and that continues to be a very important audience. But already we see that the biggest single user group are nonprofit executives. They make very good use of GuideStar's financial data to do benchmarking around financial issues. So there is clearly an opportunity for nonprofits to learn from each other on the programmatic and strategic and measurement side. That's only possible when nonprofits are willing to share enough that we're able to provide enough that that's really meaningful to nonprofits. We're getting there. So I have great hope that we can get to a point where nonprofits are learning from each other's mistakes and not just their own.
And Darren, I have a question back to you from the author David Bornstein, I believe. At least this is according to the Twitter handle. Darren, is the problem that the most important factors can't be quantified, or that our quantities are too narrow?
Well, I think that our quantities are too narrow. I think there are ways in which we can, in the aggregate, understand impact in many areas if we allow ourselves the latitude to define what impact looks like and to define the criteria for that. So I do think that it's that the criteria is often too narrow.
Great, thank you. There's a question that I think might be a good way for us to close out our conversation. We've got about 4 minutes left. And this is a question that says, what should our elevator pitch be to donors when they challenge our overhead ratio? So when a nonprofit is up in front of a donor and they say, well, your overhead rate is 30%. What is an effective comeback to that question?
I mean, one that I've heard that I like is, you don't ask the airline how much money they're spending on maintenance when you buy a ticket. And in fact, you might want them to spend some extra money on maintenance to make sure it's a safe flight. Or just more broadly, I think that this is one place where corporate metaphors are quite helpful. We don't make an investment in FedEx and say, I only want these dollars going to trucks because I think trucks are key to the FedEx business model. You don't hear analysts on Wall Street spending a lot of time talking about overhead ratios when they have every incentive to optimize their returns. So this is one place where let's learn a lesson from the private sector that has learned to focus on other questions. And for us, what matters is the mission. And so let's orient our conversation to that.
I had a very simple answer in my old life. I had to reframe it a little bit because it's much more comprehensive now. But when at community in school, I used to ask somebody if they had a child, and often they would say yes. And then I'd say, you know, do you, when your child is incredibly ill, do you stop at nothing to find the most effective doctor and the most effective medicine or intervention? Of course. And so you ask, you know how much it costs to produce a drug that has high impact? It's $1 billion investment before it goes to market, right? For really the high impact one. And so at what point do you ask the question about the overhead of that intervention, right? And so at least it gives pause and opens up a conversation so you can begin to then talk more robustly about what it is you're trying to get accomplished and why perhaps at this moment it's 30, it might be 40 next year, or go down to 20 the following year. If there's an opportunity to engage, that was often real life for most people.
I would just say that it's the wrong question. What's your overhead? I think the right question is, what impact are you having? How are you doing in the world against your mission? And I think it's important. I mean, you know, any business person would agree that, as both Dan and Jacob have said, that that's, you know, not the right question. But it does mean that you have to have a very good statement of impact, a very good understanding of the change you're contributing to in the world against your mission.
Yeah, and I guess just one reflection and perhaps a direction for future conversation is that both Jacob and Dan, you answered, you know, with a question drawing analogies from the for-profit sector, drug development or airline maintenance. And, you know, the difficulty, I think, is that, you know, when you're buying a ticket and you go and purchase the cheapest ticket you usually can find. And there's someone else who's funding the cost, the capital cost of the airline industry, right? And in your answer, Dan, too, you know, drug development can cost upwards of $1 billion per drug, but you might go around shopping for the cheapest drug if you're, you know, generics versus name brands, et cetera. And I think in our space, we are asking people to both buy and invest. And that conversation gets very complicated very quickly around that. So maybe that's a future direction of sort of disentangling some of these understandings.
Great. And I just want to thank everybody. This is Gabe again. I want to thank our panelists, our audience members for participating today. I thought it was a great conversation, and from the responses we've seen on Twitter and through the questions, everyone else seems to be pretty pleased with it as well. 2 closing thoughts to leave with. If you want more information on the subject, you can go to overheadmyth.com, and there's resources there. And then also, GuideStar put out a white paper recently that's for nonprofits on this exact subject matter, and you can find that at mpo.gs/OH white paper. So take a look at that if you want to learn more on the subject matter. Thanks again for participating, everybody, and have a great holidays.